Hello viewers, today we will discuss The Color Purple by Alice Walker, to introduce the novel and the author, to study the significance of the epistolary form of the novel, to look at the events in the novel and study it as a feminist novel. Before we begin discussing the novel, let us take a brief overview of this novel. The Color Purple, published in 1982, brought Alice Walker widespread fame and acclaim. It received both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award. Alice Walker spent her early years in the American South witnessing racial and economic hardships that frame many of her literary works. She was educated in Atlanta, traveled across America and to Africa, and participated in the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, before settling down to become a writer in the US. The Color Purple describes the struggle of black women as well as men in America through the story of a young black girl, Celie, and her family. The novel is written as a series of letters from Celie to God and describes the experience of race and womanhood in the American South of the early 20th century. The story of the novel is absorbing. The various people and events in Celie's life portray the experience of blacks in the deep American South during the period between the two wars. Physical abuse and sexual exploitation is the common fate of most women in the novel. The novel also describes in detail the lifestyle and customs of the Olinkas in Africa. The Color Purple is a distinctly black feminist novel with its special themes, narrative and language. Alice Walker, the award-winning author of The Color Purple, was born in 1944 in Eatonton, Georgia. Her parents were tenant farmers in the racially segregated Southern American state of Georgia. Alice was the youngest of 8 children in the family. She grew up witnessing economic and racial exploitation of the black people around her. During college, she was deeply influenced by Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists. She became an active member of the movement in Atlanta before she transferred to New York. During this time, she also visited Africa as an exchange student to Uganda from the Sarah Lawrence College in New York, where she completed her graduation. She married a white American and chose to divorce him to be able to dedicate her life to writing. She has often cited the strain of racial prejudice in New York, where she lived with her husband, as being a major force that eroded their relationship. After several years of active work in the civil rights movement, Alice Walker retreated to a quiet cabin amidst nature to gather the stories she had witnessed and heard of and create fiction that would be a testimony to the suffering and experience of blacks in America. She credits the communion with nature as an important inspiration behind her writing. Alice Walker terms the time she spent in her cabin in the woods, where she took long walks, went for swims and ruminated on all that she had within her, as a time of meditation. For this reason, she calls herself not only the author of the work, but also the medium through which her characters gained life. Apart from this, her childhood experience of rural Georgia, her association with the civil rights movement in Atlanta, New York, and other places in America, and her first-hand experience of the black people in Africa all deeply shape her writing. Her strengths are her ability to create a unique voice for black women folk in America, her ability to portray realistically the experience of racial exploitation in the deep American South, the depiction of a unique bond of affection amongst the black women characters whose life is otherwise wretched and loveless. For several years before The Color Purple was acclaimed and honoured through awards, movie adaptations and a Broadway musical, Alice Walker was severely criticised, especially by blacks, for the decadence of her black characters. Many people argued that she painted an unnecessarily dreary picture of black society and that it had no positive impact on either how blacks saw themselves or on how they were perceived by non-blacks. Yet, Alice Walker has maintained that she intends the development and transformation of characters like Harpo to be a model of transformation for black men who feel that subjugation of black women is a natural order of things. Many people now consider the novel to have touched their lives in a significant way. Alice Walker has long been considered one of the most important authors of the 20th century. She has authored several novels, collections of short stories, poems, essays, and even children's books. Her work is translated into many languages and is now read worldwide. A brief history of the civil rights movement in America. The civil rights movement in America arose out of the extreme inequity faced by blacks in America. It started as long back as 1860, but significant victories were won only in the 1960s. Even after slavery was abolished, the lives of black Americans were marked by racial segregation, disenfranchisement, violence, and exploitation. Several southern states refused to implement voting rights given to black males and other privileges of citizenship granted to blacks. The Black Power movement of the 1950s and 60s, started by young blacks unhappy with the non-violent and peaceful resistance of their leaders, was aimed at creating more violent resistance to this denial. The phase was marked by civil disobedience movements meant to bring white administration to its knees, bus boycotts, sit-ins at white-only sections of restaurants, and marches across many cities. The movement, led by now iconic figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others, was able to bring in legislative changes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This ended discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin and forced several states and establishments to accept the Supreme Court's ruling against racial segregation in schools, offices, and public places. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 enforced voting rights, and other acts passed in 1965 and 1968 opened doors for the immigration of blacks to America and banned discrimination on sale and rental of housing for colored people. These achievements stirred many young black people to stand up for their rights. Introduction to the novel. The Color Purple, written in 1982, is Alice Walker's most widely read work of fiction. It is considered by many to be her best work till date. The novel portrays the life of blacks in the racially segregated South of America through the stories of Cilly and her sister Nettie. The novel is multi-layered with several themes like race and gender-based exploitation, colonialism, same-sex affection, intersecting to provide a rich and vivid portrayal of life amidst the blacks in the American South. Despite Alice Walker's distance in both time and space from the experiences depicted in the novel, The Color Purple provides a vivid and stark picture of the realities of life of blacks in America. It is said that as a young graduate student in Atlanta, Alice Walker climbed a tree to hear Martin Luther's speech, "I Have a Dream." the civil rights movement made a deep impact on the young Alice Walker. The character of Celie in the novel is a passionate portrayal of the fate of black women in early 20th century America. Outcasts in both the home and society, they continually suffered at the hands of both whites and black men. They go through their life in fear, denied both education and security. Celie and other black women characters like Sophia, Shug Avery and Mary Agnes often have to rely on each other to survive. As they cope with the failure of institutions like family and marriage, they also begin exploring same-sex love, as in the case of Celie and Shug Avery. Homosexual love is an important theme explored in the novel. The portrayal of Nettie, Corinne, Olivia show how education brings both dignity and opportunities for black women. Tashi, the Olinka child, and the story of other Olinkas depicts the encounter of black Africans with modernity. The encounter with education and modernization through roads shows how societies in colonies like Africa are not equipped to adjust to the large-scale onslaught of modern imperial forces. However, the colonial encounter is not only played out in far-off locations in Africa, but repeated through the everyday subjugation of the blacks in America as well. Sophia is a defiant black woman who resists subjugation to both black men like her husband and whites like the mayor and his wife. Yet she is powerless before the brute force of the white police and prison. Beaten into suppression much like the Olinkas, she is forced to bow before white power. The distinctive and contrasting voice of characters like Celie and Nettie are important in understanding the novel. In spite of the significant disadvantages in education, Celie has a unique personality and a strong opinion. The color purple is credited with depicting a raw picture of the hardship of being black in early 20th century America. It also foregrounds the unconditional love that black women share amongst themselves, creating a sisterhood of peace for each other. It is thus a distinctly black feminist novel. An important aspect of The Color Purple is the style of the novel. It is written as a series of letters or in what is called the epistolary style. Alice Walker is the first American writer to have adopted this style of writing. The author has used this form to convey a more authentic voice of her characters. The author recedes as the audience is able to hear each character's distinct voice. The first set of letters are from Celie to God. Next, there are letters from Nettie to Celie, and then from Celie to Nettie, and then finally from Celie's letters to God again. In an epistolary novel, the author virtually disappears and readers gain a more intimate look at the characters presented. Using letters to narrate the story allowed Alice Walker to produce a distinct voice for the characters, incorporating colloquial language indicating differences in education and class. Celie first addresses her letters to God, indicating that she was reaching out to a higher authority in her misery. Since she had no one to turn to, she chose an omniscient power to complain about her troubles. When her father tries to abuse her sister Nettie, she urges Nettie to escape. When Nettie leaves, she begins writing letters to her. The other letters in the novel are from Nettie to her sister Celie. Each part of the novel is a series of one of these letters. Thus, the reader is able to discern the shift in voice that occurs with each new set of letters. The story of all the characters is not revealed at once. At first, Celie's account of Nettie disappearing without any news leave gaps in the story of what happened to Nettie. Later, when we read Nettie's letters to her sister, we understand what happened to Nettie. Thus, the epistolary form of the novel prevents a straight development of the story. This foregrounds the character's point of view about the events rather than the author's all-powerful narration. The last set of letters is from Sally to God, but this time Sally is at peace with herself and the world. While the epistolary form of the novel works to successfully introduce the African American language in the novel and contextualize the events in the early 20th century African American life, it also has some drawbacks. The difference in pronunciation and diction, especially that of Sally, is often hard for contemporary readers to decode. This is harder for readers who are not familiar with the language and culture that Sally inhabits. In addition, the lack of a clear storyline requires the reader to be patient until the end of the novel to piece together all the events that are described. The novel opens with Sally's voice speaking to God through her letter. She is 14, sexually abused by her father, and has 2 children by him. Her babies have been taken away by her father, and her mother is too ill to help her. Her father, whom she calls Pa, has been abusing her ever since her mother became ill and couldn't gratify him. Scared into silence by him, she turns to God for guidance as she is too young and confused to understand what is happening to her. Her mother dies, and now Sally is left to look after her siblings. She is terrified when their father begins to turn his attention to her little sister Nettie. In addition, a married man, whom we only know as Mr., expresses his desire to marry Nettie. Pa refuses, offering Sally instead. On her marriage day, Sally spends time bandaging her head, untangling her stepdaughter's hair, cooking dinner, and then she goes to bed thinking about her sister as Mr. lies on top of her. One day, Sally spots a little girl with a remarkable resemblance to herself in town. She is convinced that this little girl is her daughter. The girl is also called Olivia, just like she had named her daughter. She follows the girl and her mother into a cloth store where the shopkeeper is rude and impatient with the lady. Meanwhile, back home, Sally learns that Mr.'s wife was shot dead by her lover because she wanted to be with her children. Mr. also has a lover called Shug Avery, and Sally is mesmerized by the photograph she sees of Shug. While all those around her talk badly about Shug's character, Sally can't stop thinking about how beautiful she is. She begins to even like Mr. just because he is in love with Shug. Soon, Shug arrives at Sally and Mr.'s house as she has contracted a sexually transmitted disease and nobody wanted to care for her. Sally learns that Mr.'s name is Albert, and she soon realizes that Shug has a lot of power over Mr., who is very submissive before her. Sally also realizes that she has a sexual attraction towards Shug when she sees her naked for the first time. Under her care, Shug, originally a stylish singer, is soon strong enough to perform. Sally's stepson Harpo marries a strong-willed black girl called Sophia. Sophia resists all attempts by Harpo to turn her into a submissive and beaten wife like Sally. Finally, she decides to leave. Harpo opens a juke joint in his house where he invites Shug to sing. Sally finds herself pained with love sickness when she sees Shug perform. She has no problem with Mr. loving Shug, but is troubled by her own love for Shug. By the 30th letter, Silly writes, she has developed an intimate relation with Shug. After Silly's realization of her attraction towards Shug, she begins to become more self-aware. Shug was initially disdainful of Silly, but after she saw Silly's love for her, she starts appreciating her and caring for her. Shug and Silly begin talking about sexual experiences, and Shug terms Silly a virgin because she has never experienced an orgasm. Shug encourages Silly to look at herself. They laugh and giggle like girls. For Silly, the idea of sexual pleasure as described by Shug is shocking and otherworldly. Shug starts calling Silly Miss Silly, thus giving her a new identity along with a new awareness of herself. Harpo brings home another girl, Mary Agnes, whom he calls Squeak. One day, while Shug is performing at Harpo's juke joint, Sophia makes an appearance with her new boyfriend. Squeak gets upset looking at Sophia and Harpo dance and calls Sophia a bitch. Sophia slaps her and leaves. However, her defiant attitude soon gets her into trouble. Sophia is asked by the mayor's wife, Millie, to come and work in her house. When Sophia refuses, she is imprisoned, beaten, blinded in one eye. Sally gets scared looking at Sophia in the prison, but tries her best to bandage and groom her. Mr. and Sally ask Squeak to speak to the warden, who is related to Squeak, to help Sophia get released. They prepare her for the meeting by dressing her up as a white woman and hope that the warden will recognize her. However, Squeak soon returns home limping and in tatters as the warden brutally rapes her. Sophia is later sentenced to work as a maid in the mayor's house. Squeak insists on being called Mary Agnes and begins singing Shug's songs. Shug helps Silly find Nettie's letter that Albert had stashed away from her. She is angry with Mr. and for the first time thinks of leaving him. She is also overjoyed to learn that Nettie is alive and has gone to Africa, along with a missionary couple, Samuel and Corinne. She also learns that both her son Adam and her daughter Olivia have been adopted by the couple. Nettie's letters describe the life of the Olinkas and their missionary work amongst them. Nettie also writes about how women and black missionaries are perceived by both whites and Olinkas. They have little education and a completely subordinate role for women in their society. Nettie makes friends with a woman called Catherine, whose daughter makes friends with Olivia and begins to learn modern ways, acquire knowledge about books and a desire for self-independence. The Olinkas don't approve of this and insist that Tashi should follow the ways of the women in her own tribe. They also hear of the leaders in the tribes who sold all the forest land to foreigners and brought great poverty and disease to their people. Nettie is called Mama Nettie by Adam and Olivia, and the Olinkas assume that both Nettie and Corinne are Samuel's wives. Nettie describes the construction of the road by an English rubber company through the Olinka village that destroys homes and fields. The Olinkas had no clue about the Western colonial force that had overrun all the villages in the area. Soon, the Olinkas have to pay rent for their own land. Corinne begins to get uncomfortable with the resemblance between Olivia and Nettie and begins to doubt that Nettie and Samuel know each other from before. Nettie has to swear on the Bible and show Corinne her stomach to prove to her that she has never had children, so Olivia cannot possibly be her own child. She then tells Corinne about her sister Sally. Corinne soon dies and Nettie learns from Samuel the story of how the two children were adopted. Sally is moved beyond words when she hears that her pa, whose name is Alfonso, was not really her father. Nettie and Sally's father used to own a dry goods store and was lynched by a jealous white rival. Alfonso had married their mother after that. Since she had become mentally anguished about her husband's death, Alfonso took over their business. After reading these letters, Sally stops writing to God and begins writing to Nettie. Alfonso dies shortly afterwards, leaving Sally and Nettie the land, house and the shop. She and Shug soon move to her own house. Shug develops a relation with a younger man, Jeremiah, and Sally is pained but decides to let her go. Sophia comes to work for Sally, and Eleanor Jane, the mayor's daughter, attempts to right the wrongs done to her by caring for Henrietta, Sophia's daughter. Soon, Shug returns home to Sally in Georgia, and Nettie comes home with Samuel, Tashi and Adam. Mary Agnes leaves her husband Grady to live with her sister. The novel ends with the family gathering together on the 4th of July in Sally and Nettie's home, and Mary Agnes explaining to Henrietta that the family reunion is made possible because white people are out celebrating their independence, leaving the black folks with a day of freedom. So viewers, we have come to the end of part 1 of this lesson on The Color Purple by Alice Walker. In this part, we discussed a brief overview of the novel and a biography of its author Alice Walker. We also looked at the importance of the epistolary form of the novel, and we understood the significance of the novel as a feminist novel. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. See you in the next class.